Yeah, so glad to be here. Hi, everybody. Good to see folks again. There's been lots of motion going on lately. I'm excited. Um, the Both in, like in embroider is lots of motion, yes, for sure. Like things are really landing. We've really hit the point where you get to that point in a project where you've cleaned up enough of the layers that all of a sudden things get easier, and it really is there in embroider right now. Like just yesterday, I re-enabled our full test suite against all of the latest Ember releases. So like we track Canary beta release LTSs and things like that. And for quite a while there, we had been pinned to very specific ones because things were in flux and fragile. And I just turned off all that pinning and tested against everything, and they're all working. Um, and I have a PR open right now that I'm working through, which is removing the very last vestiges of the AMD loader, and there's nothing in there, so it's like going quite smoothly. I'm finding that like there's one feature left I realized where we embroider internally is using it. I'm gonna get rid of that, and it's just gone. Feels really good. And you know, stuff that we every time I'm like, oh, did we solve that part of the problem? Yeah, we did. It's great. It's moving quickly. It's feeling really good. Um, in Ember Source 2, quite a lot of action. So we've got on the RFC front a bunch of discussion and progress around some new features that are good. Um, we For a couple small quality of life ones that are accepted RFCs that are under development now is like there's a handful of things people want to be that often that are once you go to template tag become importable. Like hey, you have to import on and you have to import hash and there's a few of those. We've got four accepted RFCs to make four things built in. That's the hash array on and what's the other one? There's another one. Um, those are under
Function.
implementation.
Function maybe?
Thank you. Yeah, FN, exactly. Yeah, function. So those are Yehuda picked them up and started implementing them. And because he wants to do them properly all the way down in the Glimmer keywords layer. And in the process found and fixed a bunch of stuff that had just been kind of long-standing cruft that needed to get dealt with. You know, things that where, it's always better to fix things at the right layer than the wrong layer. But sometimes when you're in a hurry, you make compromises, right? And there were things done in Ember that instead that could have moved down to Glimmer, and all that cleanup has been nice stuff to see. Um, we have along with that, he's actually got at it's not exposed into Ember yet, but in the handlebars parser side and the Glimmer side, actual hash and array literal syntax. So like make an array with square brackets in handlebars. So like pretty nice stuff. That of course needs an RC to be exposed in Ember, but like the infrastructure is there. It kind of fell out of work to make private fields also work in handlebars um, because you needed to fix the parser a little bit. And making private fields work, I don't think that's really an RFC thing. That's really a close the gap thing. But along with that came these other benefits now that we're poking at the handlebars parser there. Um, we landed the a new runtime template compiler APIs. There's like a historic way to get access to runtime template compilation if you wanted it, but now there's just an importable path for that. Um, and Oh, and so Ember Source 6.1, which is in a beta right now, is a purely a V2 add-on. Um, it is so it needs no broccoli, it needs no pre-build. It will just be consumable directly by a tool like Vite. Um, we've figured out how to do it in a non-breaking way for all users. So people on classic builds can still upgrade to Ember 6.1 beta. They won't break. They should not see any observable changes. Um, we uh we we threaded the needle there to tweak the behaviors on the classic build so that it wouldn't change. And so I was just looking over the list of what V1 add-ons we still have when you start a brand new thing using all the latest stuff. It's gotten quite a small list. Now, like we're gonna keep supporting V1 V10 for background. V1 add-ons is like the traditional way add-ons are made, and V2 add-ons is the spec that we wrote to go with Embroider to make our add-ons much more plays nice with the ecosystem kind of libraries. They don't need to be run inside of Broccoli and inside of Ember CLI. They can just be consumed as a library. Um, so we've got like looking at the list, there's like 3 or 4 things left, like small ones, like Glimmer tracking needs to be updated, although it's an empty package. So I guess it doesn't matter. That's a topic for a separate cleanup. Turns out you can delete that one and nothing will happen. Actually, you need it for types only at the moment. Um, so that's just a little brain dump of like cool stuff that's going on that I'm excited about. This is for questions, of course. I don't need to keep talking, but I wanted to throw a few topics out there to give people ideas of things they might want to ask about.
So who has questions?
Yeah, I had one more. Tracked built-ins. There was some desire to put that in the blueprint, but there were some bugs that you mentioned on an issue there. You think those are going to be hard to solve or fairly easy?
I think it is in the blueprint now.
Is it?
So we had talked about as we've been as we were tracking, there was an RC to put track built-ins in the blueprint. It was accepted and all, and we were project managing it through the phases of the RFCs. And for a while there, we had said like, oh, before we call this done and recommended, it would be great if somebody wants to improve the interop between tracked built-ins and old school computed properties, because we think it's possible, and there's examples of people having started the work, but it needs somebody to pick it up and do it. Um, Nobody did. Nobody was super motivated to do that. And so eventually we were just like, well, like it's okay. People are already using it. It's been in the blueprint for a while. We'll say that's good enough. If anybody is excited to do those, I assume that's the first thing that comes to mind when you mentioned bugs there. It's not so much like bugs as strictly speaking as the interop between computeds and tracked built-ins could be nicer. Um, that's the stuff I know of. If there's other stuff I'm not thinking of, oh, you linked me. There we go. Let's see.
There was something Preston was talking about performance improvements related to tracked array, but I don't know what he was talking about there.
Hmm.
And there's another one about performance of splice.
That's a good question. Not something I've looked into. So it is in the blueprint, right? I'm pretty sure. Uh,
Yeah, I confirmed it on Ember new output. It
yeah,
is there.
it is. Um, so if people find use cases that they've benchmarked that are not good, we should definitely take a look. Um, some of the stuff that's unchecked in that older issue, like decide on the constructor side things, that did get resolved. Like it's effectively the idea is that we're not trying to mimic the full constructor side API of the native array or the native object. It's the only the instance side of the API that we're trying to be drop in for. So um, that was the conclusion we went with there, and I think that makes a lot of sense. Because that's ultimate. Even when you think about TypeScript's own perspective on how the static side of things and the instance side of things is different, is a very distinct thing. Um, we're trying to provide an object that can fulfill the instance side API. And it doesn't really, it's not, there's not really a use case where you're obligated to fulfill the static side of the API because you're going to make a tracked thing and hand it off, right? Not have a kind of pluggable system that's got to generate arbitrary new, like, I don't know, a system that makes objects, but you want to tell it, no, use the tracked objects, like use that constructor instead. Doesn't, it's a much weirder use case. Yeah. Um, and I can't comment directly on the comment about the performance there. I'm not sure. Um, the I one thing I guess I would say is so this mentions the fact that the storage primitives are polyfilled. That is still true. At least the polyfill is still present. I don't know if it's active. We should take a look at that. Um, all of this, however, so I guess I'll say as a meta point on this topic. So there's the core Ember, right? There's the Ember/Ember/Ember.js repo where Ember source lives. There's the Glimmer VM repo where our low-level infrastructure lives. And there's also been the Glimmer.js repo, which is itself a mono repo, and it has a bunch of packages in it. And it's where Glimmer component and Glimmer tracking have historically lived. That repo really got created to experiment with the whole Glimmer X project that some folks were excited to work on, about trying to make just like use smaller parts of the Glimmer infrastructure, in like isolated component kind of use case. Glimmer X itself, like nobody's maintaining, nobody's particularly interested in. I honestly think we've now reached the point where Ember itself, like on the new blueprint, basically can do it. If you only want to render a component, you can, and you won't get the rest. So like we've basically achieved the original vision of that stuff. But the Glimmer X project, also, or sometimes also called Glimmer.js, but it's confusing terminology. It was just kind of sitting, and it was just kind of awkward that Glimmer component and Glimmer tracking packages lived in that repo, and it made them hard to maintain and ship alongside all our other stuff. So we archived Glimmer.js, moved Glimmer component into the Ember repo because it already even had, like, there were already placeholders there for it because that's where its API docs lived and all kinds of stuff. So it went into there where it kind of belongs and is now published from there. Glimmer tracking needs the same treatment. As I mentioned, it turns out it doesn't actually have any implementation in it today. The implementation is already in Ember source. The separate package was published again from Glimmer.js because of the complexities of trying to do the Glimmer X project, and we don't need to deal with that. So now that we've like archived that repo and don't need to deal with the cruft in there, it's actually quite a bit easier for us to clean up stuff in Glimmer component and Glimmer tracking. So doing the Glimmer tracking that has the proper primitives now is a more straightforward thing to do. There's just a policy question of whether we care about continuing to publish it as a separate NPM package or just treat, like, now that it's rolled into the Ember source repo, it could be like all the other things you get from Ember source if we wanted it to be, right? They aren't packages, and that's not ideal from a bunch of perspectives, but it's also very helpful from the perspective of like having 100 packages with a bunch of peer dependencies between them opens you up to package manager hell in a way that we'd rather avoid. So in any case, we have a much clearer deck now to solve problems like implementing a feature in Glimmer tracking that were like they were blocked by this organizational annoyance before, and now they're not.
I have a question that we got from the team before, which is about the upcoming Polaris edition. So what's the status? What's the plan?
Status? Yeah, so I mean, the major legs of Polaris, right, are template tag, Vite. I mean, potentially, and then like ideally, like routing, but the scope of routing is flexible. So template tag is of course very, very far along. Lots of people are using it. Katie and I have been looking at the docs weekly, and we have a little time set aside to poke at the docs and guides because really that's the last big piece, is making sure there's guides content and docs content around using strict handlebars, template tag, that sort of thing. As soon as we sat down to start writing that stuff, we immediately realized we cannot leave the route templates as they are as HPS because it's just an incoherent teaching story. And so we wrote an RFC to do basically to be the very very smallest MVP of Polaris routing, which is just allow template tag as route templates, like allow you to replace your app templates index.hbs with an index.gjs. That would be the smallest possible thing that would make routing at least a coherent story. Like, of course, we have another wish list of stuff we want routing to be. But if you only did the smallest possible thing to make the teaching experience of Polaris consistent, we think that would be it. So that's an open RFC. Chris linked us to it. There's and it's everybody's pretty much on board. The only discussion going on on that RFC right now is around some people are suggesting a wider scope of the RFC, and I as original author of it, am just kind of pushing for the smaller scope of the RFC. But either way, the core feature of that's in there, it seems like everybody's on board with it. And for those who've been around a while, yes, this is in fact routable components. You can call it that if you really want to. But it has a lot of nice properties. Certainly if anybody who's already started adopting template tag in an app, if teams that have started doing that are very often reaching for the Ember Route template add-on, which gives you basically this kind of capability, because it is very awkward to not have template tag in that one spot. And especially if you're using TypeScript and Glint, because if all your stuff is template tag, you don't need to do any kind of global declaration, type declaration nonsense with your components and your helpers and your modifiers. But as soon as you want to use one of those from a non-template tag, from an HPS file, now you've got to actually handwrite these other declarations and stuff for it. I don't really think that's worth it, like to manage that, because like it's not something you're going to need once you get through the migration, right? So if you migrate your code in the right order to template tag, you don't have to go write all those hand declarations, or at least you'll do fewer of them. So yeah, so I think it's a good feature. It feels good. And we did the implementation first before we even opened the RFC, just to show that it's pretty straightforward. So there's discussion on the implementation as well for a few small things it could do even nicer, but it's basically ready. Yeah. Oh, so that was part of the Polaris status question. So rounding around on that. So that's template tag, I mean, you can kind of split the template tag work also into like 3 branches. One is basic implementation. So for that, like it's pretty much shipped and out there. There's some bug fixes. I believe we just fixed the outstanding this compilation bug. That was like one of the on the hit list. So there's like not any major actual build time bugs around template tag that are known. It's pretty good now. There's the tooling side, and that's one of the things on the table to help push it faster with the Ember initiative, because Alex Machnier has done a ton of work on Glint to do a next gen of Glint that it turns out there's frameworks for building even language servers. And so rather than the hand-rolled thing that Glint used in the initial version, the stable kern version, he put it onto a framework called Volar that gives us a bunch of the features we'd want to improve the DX of Glint language servers. So in terms of like getting better suggestions as you type, getting better automatic insertion of import statements, all that stuff. There's a bunch of developer experience improvements in that work. I know a lot of folks are already using the unstable Glint and liking it. So, like anything, I'm sure there's work left to do to get the polish up there and ship it. I guess I would say the one caveat, and probably why they haven't shipped it as stable, is it really is only for template tag world. Having a separate HBS and JS file, well, in this case, TypeScript, so a separate TS and HBS file is not something that implements, and it probably won't. There's so much more complexity there. So I think getting onto the new, it's an incentive to get onto the newer stuff, because it's much cleaner and faster and nicer. So that's the tool. So there's implementation piece, the tooling piece, and the docs piece of template tag. And I mentioned the docs is what it fed us back into implementation, saying we really want to do at least minimal routing. So that's the status of template tag as a feature. Definitely an adoptable one already, but to call it done, we want to make sure we're checking those 3 areas. And template tag being the first major leg of Polaris. Second one is Vite, and we've talked a bunch about that already. So that's why we want to get the V2 blueprint to be the default, right? That would be another key piece. Had a discussion yesterday in the Dev Embroider channel about like, why don't we just call it the Polaris blueprint? And in my mind, it's actually it would be better to call it the Vite blueprint, because that's the core feature that we're really talking about with that RFC. It's adoption of Vite. And so like you can separately, in whatever order you need to for your app, you can adopt Vite, you can adopt template tag, you can do both those things at one time, but you could do them separately in any order, because you've got to, it makes sense to try to break up and chunk your updates. So the app blueprint specifically about getting you onto Vite. And yes, that blueprint has support for template tag, but you can adopt template tag before you adopt the new blueprint or after, and that's okay. So they're separate, two separate legs of what is Polaris. And then the third major thing that we would want in Polaris is to reform routing. We've had different scaling ambitions on what the scope of that looks like. As I said, I think the very minimal one to that gives you something coherent is the RFC we just talked about. The follow-up, the next level up of scope would be to do the route manager RFCs that Marco was talking about, which is also something potentially in scope for the Ember initiative. And so the work there really is, the first work there is identifying, like really getting precise and writing a spec for the current behaviors and the hooks you would need on a route manager. And so this would allow us, so what this would mean is just like how with components, you can interoperate freely between Ember components, Glimmer components, and any custom component managers that people might want to write. You can interleave them in any order and they all work out because they have this common base manager API behind them all, right? And we'd like to do that at the level of routes because then you could actually you could ship a new implementation of how a route works and actually let it interoperate so that in an app with 100 routes, you could try out the new one in one and see how it works. And if you like it, start to port or even leave your old ones and just write new routes the new way. That is kind of we think that's a great step. That would let us solve a whole lot of things about routing that today are just vestiges of an earlier era, just because we haven't come back around to redo those APIs after we did other things. So, now that we have a modules-based build that can split your apps, there's things we would do differently about the route definitions to make sure that the things split nicely by default. And a thing that I've wanted to fix forever would be to make it so that model hooks can run in parallel, or the lifetimes on routes are not helpful because, of course, they existed before we had an Ember destroyables API. So, like, a very natural way to routes have a whole bunch of idiosyncratic hooks for things like activate, deactivate, and stuff like that. But you don't need any of that once you have the APIs we already have, like Ember destroyable, which is just objects have lifetime. If you want to do something at the end of the lifetime, you have a standard API for that. And that all composes, right? Like if you use something like Ember resources to put a resource on a component, it'll get cleaned up when the component is destroyed. If you put that same resource on a route today, it'll never get cleaned up because the route has the wrong lifetime. But we could fix that if we just had a new route, right? Making the API much smaller and easier to learn and cleaner. And then there's a third stage of ambition in terms of new routing, which so I would say that both the minimal one is definitely on the table as the thing we could do for Polaris and call it done. The router manager is also a thing that we could be in scope for Polaris, depending on how fast, fund that initiative and let's get it done fast so we can call it Polaris. The third level, I think, is probably, it would be a stretch goal to call it Polaris. I don't think we want to push Polaris that far, which would be to do a router manager, not a route manager. And that would be like to abstract over the whole routing and drop in a wholly new system. And that would give you a lot more capabilities. Like people often talk about some of the use cases where it's hard to do today. Like the routing paradigm we have today is great for apps that have kind of one primary focus stack. But if you have multiple stacks of stuff going on, people want some of the kinds of patterns you can get more in mobile apps. So just as an example, I think it enables some of those patterns. An example of a thing people might want to do by completely replacing routing with a new thing or making it possible to completely replace would be some of that stuff. So like I think that's a further level beyond doing the route level one, right? Because the thing with the route level one is I think it's necessary to do that first because you need to let people port route by route, right? If something requires you to rewrite 100% of your routes all at once, I think you're going to have too many apps that are stuck forever behind that. That would not be tenable. If it's something where you can start doing when you write new code, you write it the new way, and you're welcome to port old code or let it keep running for a long, long, long time bringing in that functionality even as a library later if it drops out of the core, that's much more tenable, right? So we need to do the route level one anyway, and so that's why I think that's a very good target. And the router level one, yeah, it would be a stretch goal to do the complete replacement. Now that said, once you're on the fully modules based, Vite based, Ember 6.1 beta and newer kind of build, where Ember's always a bunch of loose modules, barring a little bit of cleanup we want to do around how even some things no, actually mostly just add-ons, not Ember itself. A little cleanup around cleaning up the old Ember barrel file, meaning like import Ember from Ember. There's a lot of that floating around still. We tried to deprecate it to be removed at 6, but it was a little too much to do too fast and was gonna break a lot of people. So we've pushed it back. But once that's cleaned up, everything really is importable piece by piece. So if you don't want to use routing and you want to use something else, that will be possible already. Like to simply not use the stock routing. You would never load the code if you aren't using it. But like if you just want a component, that should also just work already without any new RFCs or anything. Just a matter of adopting the new modules-based build. And in fact, to make that really clear, there's like Yehuda has an open PR because I told him this was important and he agreed to make an explicit render component API. Just like that's always been possible, but kind of hidden away. And once we have that, I kind of would like to actually retcon our current thinking about how the router does it in terms of that API. Because in principle, you should be able to ask Ember to give me a stock router for this app, and what you get back to component, and you say render component that, and that's the main entry point of your code, right? Now it becomes obvious to where you could delete that and put in something else and get a completely different experience. And so when you talk about stuff like building Ember building web components out of Ember, you'd want that kind of thing for that case, right? Because getting a whole app package as a web component is one thing. That's very doable, not too hard. It's already something people can do if they know how things work. But in practice, what you often want for that is you really want to make an actual web component that really just does the work of one component. You don't really want it to have a router and everything else inside. So I think it all dovetails nicely with that stuff. And that stuff does not really require us to do a massive rethink of the existing router. It's really just a matter of making sure that untangling all the affordances so you can see where it is and use it when you want it and not use it when you don't want it. So that was a long-winded summary of kind of status of Polaris. Oh, well, there's another leg, I guess, of Polaris, which is like first-class TypeScript support, but that is pretty landed. So I had kind of not talked about it. We basically have that.
One. Sorry.
Yeah, we basically have that, and it's stable, and it is now even landing in the blueprints. For a while there, we were waiting till there was enough type support in Ember Data for Ember Data users to also interoperate with that, but there is now. So that has gotten into a pretty good spot.
We have one question in the chat from Kenny. I remembered reactivity resources was also going to be part of Polaris. Is that still the case?
Yes, for sure. I guess the question is going to be just what. That's a good question. There's an important gap in, I think, the teaching story around that, and that does imply work to do. At the very high level, like the reactivity pattern is not really in question. There's not really a new thing to make. In the abstract sense, a resource is a very boring thing. It's like if you have tracked and you have destroyable, like any object that can use those things can function as a resource and it's fine. But that's not a satisfying answer until we have good materials on how to do that and like good recommendations on the best, tools that are going to help you with that. So, for example, a version of Ember resources or an iteration on that. I think we have Yeah, so that's well taken actually. That's a good important piece of work that I was neglecting to put on the list, but that I think is critical as well. So I guess what that would look like is um the work at this point has happened a lot in Ember resources and in Starbeam as like the test beds for the ideas. Um so I guess the thing to look for there would be an RFC blessing those into the framework and putting them in the blueprint. And I think to make that happen, it's gonna generate a to-do list of things we want before we, I don't think the exact current releases of either of those is quite ready to go. There's like wish list. There's stuff that we want to continue to do, and I think trying to do that RFC would tease out what remains to make it very learnable. I do find I worked on some apps where teams are trying to adapt this stuff, and it's very, very helpful when it goes well. And then when folks don't understand it, it's very easy to shoot yourselves in the feet still. So we want to sand off those edges. Um, you just gotta lifetime management in general is a hard problem in computing, right? It's why like it's a big reason Rust exists. Lifetime management is hard, so let's get the compiler to do it for you is like why Rust is a language. Um, in the case of an Ember app, like lifetime management, mostly you don't have to worry about, which is great. Um, Resources definitely care, and I guess the reason it comes up more is as we're getting better and better at integrating just like natural JavaScript patterns into Ember apps. Um, the you just have to see a lot more of them in the machinery gets exposed to you. What I mean is like if you there's a lot of patterns that if you implement them in a template, uh, all the reactivity happens automatically for you and you don't really have to think about it. But if you tried to do the exact same thing in the JavaScript side, well, like historically, sometimes you just couldn't, and that was frustrating. And we've steadily reduced that problem to the point where you can do most things purely from the JavaScript side. But when you do, now a bunch of the reactivity concerns become things you care about now in your code, right? And so that's why I think it was correct to point out reactivity slash resources as important to Polaris because it is of a theme with the rest, right? The very high level theme of Polaris is like really integrating and playing well with modern JavaScript, both where the language has gone, where the ecosystem has gone, where the tooling is, and so like all the things we've talked about really are examples of that, right? Having Vite as a build tool, having really good TypeScript support, having uh, template tag being an import driven tool that actually works well with both those other things, like the build tool like Vite, the type checker like TypeScript. Um, all of it is that's the story, right? Glint, for example, another part of it. It's all about making sure that our stuff is legible within a modern JavaScript context. And resources is very much part of that too, because it's aligned with proposals like signals in the language itself. And the more we make Ember stuff exposed as JavaScript primitives, the more you simply need to understand how reactivity is going to work in those objects. You can't just keep it isolated away. In the template language, we can design so the reactivity is not seen. And that's part of what's great about them, and that's part of why they're still good. You wouldn't want to have to hand write the JavaScript for all your templates. But when you do need some JavaScript and you want it to interact with your templates, the reactivity concerns, you do see them and you need to think about them a little bit. And we need to give people helpful patterns for that.
We have one more question that's I think a bit related to all of the conversation about Polaris, and the question is, what do you imagine Ember being in 5 years? So that's I guess like 2 editions after Polaris.
Well, let's see. I mean, it is kind of fun to think about what do you do when you have cleaned up all of the things you didn't want. So I still really think so personally, having like being interested in dev tools and getting really good developer experiences and stuff. I want to come back around on stuff that I talked about quite a while back, demoing build environments that are wholly browser runtime driven You don't need a node runtime at all, even with your package, like even to have nice package management and nice build tooling, and you can use TypeScript and you can use template tag to have all of that in an environment where it's all run by the browser using a combination of workers and service workers and browser APIs. I would love to have that. I think it's a very powerful thing that I don't see anybody doing yet. And I think it is kind of a fun time to look at that because now that we have our builds streamlined down to just being modules, I think it'd be really fun to revisit that stuff, and I think you'd get pretty good experience. Other stuff. So something else I'm excited about that I think we could incorporate. And this one's not a 5 years out. This is something we could do much sooner, but it's an example of what I'm excited about and how I think how I hope people would use Ember 5 years from now. That would just be obvious at that point, which is the view transitions API is a browser feature that has really reached the adoption point where you can start to rely on it now. For many, many apps at least. And it's quite good. It's pretty much all the things I'd want from an animation system. And I know I know there was a demonstration of that that folks have been sharing that does it in the routing context, because at least when we do route transitions, you have a promise that resolves, like you can know before and after the route transition, and that's enough to plug into this browser animation system, and then just basically write CSS animation rules to move all your stuff around, where you actually get access to both the before render and after render states, and the browser itself just takes care of like letting you animate between them all. It's really great. I want to do that for any possible transition in Ember. So like I think the Glimmer VM itself could expose a component manager capability that you could wrap a component around a block of DOM and say like in here, that stuff is subject to view transitions. And then whenever there's a re-render, for whatever reason, your CSS rules can just animate all the stuff. And that's a really, really nice feature I want to do. So like that's an example of where, like I think, yes, I hope an Ember developer 2 editions out thinks that's the obvious solution to solve, like to some animation problem they have, is that platform API is available to them. And when they, go and look at the docs and to say like, well, how do I do that in Ember? There's an obvious answer that says, great, you can use that. It's right here. This is how you can plug it right into the rendering system and it's going to work. And so, yeah, like that kind of general theme is when you have a question, how do I do this? The most powerful stuff in the web ecosystem that would be an obvious answer is the obvious answer for you in Ember. And how do you do it is obvious, or like a quick search away.
So would you think that Ember, and I guess other frameworks as well, sort of would sort of get smaller over time, not in the sense of weight or like kilobytes or so, but in the sense of like framework specific like patterns and concepts and APIs as sort of the platform and the language evolve. And
I think that's always been a vision and a hope, is that over time stuff that we have to do ourselves becomes platform features, right? And there's subtleties to that, right? I know that there's folks, it was trendy for a while there to say that React Virtual DOM should just become part of the browser, right? And it's like, that's extremely implementation specific. Let's focus a little more high level APIs here and not lock in implementations, right? But whereas I think a proposal like Signals it's a low level proposal for how to integrate things, but it's a much more serious solution that absolutely would make frameworks smaller if we get folks to agree on that proposal and we ship that, right? Because a whole bunch of the work that frameworks do differently could all plug into that. And I think if if Signals reached baseline in all the browsers, like we could throw away a bunch of code, React could throw away code, Vue could throw away code, because they'd all just like be a small amount of code calling into the Signals API. And then they would all interoperate with each other too. And that'd be really nice, right? That's great when we can raise that. It is something I believe about frameworks, is that they really are like they exist to try to um, do the experimentation work about what the future standard should be, right? Because the hard part about standards, of course, is you got to get a bunch of people to agree, and that takes time and effort, and it's hard, and it's, you know, it feedback cycles are long, but you need a lot of feedback to do it well. And, nobody should be surprised when standards processes take a while, but the value of that is huge once you finally get there. And so what framework communities do, and I think Ember's been especially good at this because we've been especially focused on trying to stick together as a community and trying to do standardization of things, because like it's a much bigger lift to get the whole web to agree on something, right? Like getting the Ember community to agree on RFC is much easier than getting the whole web to agree on something, right? But once we do it and we get a lot of experience with it, and then other people can learn from us, and they'll build their own slightly different version of a reactivity system, and we'll learn from each other. And as these communities are pushing the state of the art forward, eventually you reach a consensus that's bigger than them. And so I really think frameworks serve a very useful purpose there of being a proving ground and like they're pushing the frontier of consensus standardization of things that just belong in platforms. Because that's the only way we ever make software easier to write, right? Is to like raise the bar in terms of what the platforms that you're building on can do for you out of the box. And take it off the table so you don't have, so you can think about your problem and not think about how do I update the DOM now, right? Or whichever problem it is. Yeah. Chris commented content tag TC39 when. That would be great too. That's not like an impossible problem. It needs champions, it needs to be pushed, but I do think the idea of that is to make like our template tags, to make a proposal like that general purpose so that JavaScript has an inline way to insert snippets of other languages, right? You could make our template tag actually just be a specific example of a general purpose JavaScript feature where this is how you embed other languages. And people would want that for templates like ours or views templates, but they might also want it for style, for embedding CSS in JavaScript, and they might want it for embedding GraphQL in JavaScript. And like there's a lot of reasons content tag's a good idea. That's why we called it content tag and then just call it template tag in the implementation. The hope is that you could do a general purpose one and then have a little bit of glue in your environment to decide when we encounter a template tag, what does that actually mean in JavaScript? How do I make that available to the code?
Yeah, last question about Ember 6 browser support.
Sure.
So I guess the question is what browsers are dropped, right?
Well, that's easy because other people already wrote it down for me. The browser support page on Ember.js. So if you go under releases, there's a browser support page. It lists the current stuff, but then it has a little call out box for what's in 6. I guess we haven't written down the hard ones, huh? Okay, I take it back. Maybe that's why you're asking. We haven't taken the snapshot of the numbers, huh?
I saw the numbers. I don't remember where exactly, but it would be nice to have them written on the website. And
yeah.
And we are about to be stuck. We won't be able to make it to the 6.0 because we are supporting all browsers, and I'm worried about this. That's why I'm asking.
Yeah.
So
what was that, Chris?
Yeah, there is actually a pull request that was supposed to be released. That was supposed to be merged at the 6.0 release, and we just haven't done the docs stuff yet. So there's an actual hard list that will be added to that. The other thing to note is that we're talking about support, like official support, and there are cases where we're going to be opting into certain features that aren't going to be compiled away, etc. But if you recall back to what we were talking about with the Vite blueprint and you having your own Babel support, your Babel config that you can add things to that don't come like baked into Ember, there is a legitimate case where we may not support certain browsers out of the box, but you can add that support back with your own definition of what Babel preset env or whatever the case may be. So
but
it's
the Ember
not.
source would be compiled through our Babel config?
Yes. You can set it up that way. Like I'm pretty sure that you can set it up with Vite to do it that way.
No, it
So
is that way.
that would
There's no
be
other way to do
It
it.
is that way. Yeah.
Yeah.
okay. So that would be an
you do have
argument
control
for.
over that. And now that doesn't mean everything, right? Not 100% of features are going to be Babel fillable, but I don't know, I don't know exactly where the hard edges are. Alex on the tooling team is a good person to ask because he's crazy. He's a crazy person. He supports IE 11 still on like modern Ember. I don't know how.
He's doing some really wild things to Ember 5X stuff. But yeah, so it is possible. It's just that it's not out of the box anymore, and it becomes a you problem, not a whole community problem.
But
And
the Vite blueprint would be a useful tool for this.
yes, very much so.
Thanks.
Yeah, especially when you're talking like the 5 to 6 transition, because right now the Vite blueprint you need to get onto 5x for it. We hope to port it back further, but out of the box right now, you need to be on a 5x. That's mostly because of fixes that landed in Ember source that just make it awkward on other ones. We will potentially be able to go further back by just doing some combination of some backports of fixes in earlier Embers and like building more custom patches into Embroider itself to patch over some of those differences. But yeah, if the question is like, can I like going 5 to 6, the Vite blueprint would work on either side of that boundary, so it would be able to help you there. I'm trying to remember what hard features there were in the old Safaris that made us excited to drop them.
The key thing was private class fields, because we rewrote your decorator transform to not use static blocks and to rely on the private class fields, because that meant that what were you saying? It was like a 20% drop in bundle size if you're not using Babel's decorator
Well,
transform
that's a good point.
shenanigans.
Yeah. So that does work even on old browsers now because someone came around and we did a PR to you can run decorator transforms in the pre-phase now of Babel. So it means that no matter what features we use as our target, as long as your own preset compiles them away, it'll still work. So that is not a hard limit anymore. But it's true that you get things like private fields, and all that's really nice, especially especially for debuggability. Obviously, in your development, you can keep that stuff untranspiled. That's another good point in terms of, I was mentioning how I love the Vite stuff for debuggability. The other one that I can't really live without now is switching to decorator transforms in your Ember app. Thing you can do in any Ember app. The repo, it's ef/decorator transforms says at the bottom of the README how to use it in an Ember app. But I re-implemented legacy decorators from the perspective of like the JavaScript features we have today. Because when that stuff was first written, like there was no static blocks, there was no private fields, and it was unlikely that you'd have those things. But now that we usually do have those things, certainly in your development environments, you do. You can do decorators in a much more thin legacy decorators, right? The ones that we currently use. You can do them in a much thinner transformation that does not require you to transpile everything else about your classes. So the only reason you see like private fields being transpiled in an Ember app today, it's not because your preset env requires it. It's because because the decorator transform is requiring it. And so like no private fields, no class fields, all that stuff you can leave untranspiled and it's way easier to work with. And you get way less big blobs of Babel helper gobbledygook at the starts of your files and all that. So that is like the time that you'll get that by default is it is default in the V2 blueprint. But you can adopt it now as well in a classic app if you want to.
And does that change production build size?
Yeah, we've seen like 20% decreases in production build size if you're using a kind of a relatively stock targets.
Okay.
Yeah.